28 Years Later is among the returning horror franchises of 2025, surprising audiences with a jump in time to explore the aftermath of the rage virus. And one update about the production, however, suggests that a dark theory about Cillian Murphy's former lead character is far more likely. But before we get into it, if you haven't done so already, please hit the subscribe button, like and comment on the video, and if you're able, please sign up for channel memberships for exclusive content, which really helps us out. Anyway, back to the video. So, Murphy's gym was presumably rescued at the end of the franchise's first film. Despite this, the long-awaited 28 Years Later trailer dropped several hints about his fate. Although audiences were convinced the star appeared in the teaser as an undead, this assumption was debunked by the recent confirmation that Murphy won't return in 28 Years Later. However, an interview between Empire and producer Andrew McDonald revealed that the actor could return for future sequels. There is one theory connected to 28 Years Later that signals a rather disturbing fate for Jim's character. The trailer for the upcoming feature sets a far more ominous tone and implies the threat behind the infected is worse than it's ever been. The 28 Years Later trailer makes several references to Jimmy first painted on a wall beside a spiritual message and later carved into a body of an unidentified individual. Considering the sinister nature of these circumstances, it's reasonable to assume that whoever this figure is will play a crucial role in the new story. As yet, it's uncertain whether these messages are connected to Jim. However, a prominent 28 Years Later theory links these messages to Murphy's character. It's been speculated that Jim may have gone rogue following the betrayal he encountered towards the end of 28 Days Later. His mistrust of the authorities could have gained him a large following, framing him as a cult leader. It would not be difficult for Jim to be in over his head if this were the case, making it likely that Jimmy could be a reference to his new era as a villain. The Oscar-winning actor will be absent from 28 Years Later, but Murphy's rumored return to the franchise in future installments supports the theory that he could be the new overarching enemy. It's important for Jim to be missing from the new film as it provides the space for new characters to establish themselves and justify their own motives. Neglecting to acknowledge Jim's character in 28 Years Later will allow audiences to develop a deeper connection with the new leads, similar to 28 Weeks Later, resulting in Murphy's much-anticipated arrival at a later date being more impactful. More importantly, 28 Years Later will be the beginning of a much larger story. The trilogy will continue with the Bone Temple in 2026 and a third film at a later date. If Jim becomes the story's encompassing villain, it's sensible not to reintroduce him until the second film. Being duplicitous about when Murphy will return and concealing his involvement in the project builds the suspense around the menacing presence of Jimmy in 28 Years Later. Consequently, omitting Murphy from 28 Years Later acts as a more damning consequence of Jim's ill-fated character arc. Jim is susceptible to becoming a villain following his introduction to the post-apocalyptic movie. In a rare scenario, Jim was comatose during the outbreak. Over the course of the film, Jim is forced to come to terms with the tragic loss of his parents while learning how to survive in the dystopian world. These elements pave the way for an incredibly compelling transformation from Jim into the franchise's villain. Given that the virus has evolved in the aftermath of 28 Weeks Later, it's understandable that the remaining survivors may have fallen on a dark path in its wake. Furthermore, Jim has experienced many traumatic ordeals. On his journey with Selena, his first encounter with the infected individual was a young child. It's clear that the remaining survivors are forced to abandon their morals, and Jim is no exception. 28 Years Later making Jim a villain would be a fitting end for his character, as it would be a more credible consequence of his prolonged exposure to the horrors of this world. It would certainly be an interesting dynamic to explore, as he could become a tyrant, a revolutionary, or something completely different.